In this video, I'm going to show you how to attach all of the power lines into common buses. So before, when you mounted the ESCs, you brought the power leads through these holes. So you can see that there's red wires. Those are all going to be soldered together. And there's black wires that'll all be soldered together. This is the positive and negative 12-volt bus for the system. Additionally, we're going to need to route 12 volts around to the other side. And so we're going to do that with these purple wires. It's leftover motor lead wire and battery wire that you got a coil of. So that's going to loop around to the other side. And then we're also going to have a wire that comes from the power bus and goes into the Molex connector. So to start out, we're just going to want to strip all of these. And I've already done that for 2 of these, but basically you can use an auto stripper. You probably want it to be a little bit longer than that actually. You probably want it to be, I don't know, like so, about 1 centimeter long. So strip that for all of these. If you don't have an auto stripper like this, you can just use a knife. Be careful not to nick too many of the interconducting wires. So let me just finish that up really quick. Definitely recommend auto strippers. They make things really easy. So there's kind of a trick to this. If you've ever soldered a bunch of wires together before, you'll know it can be really challenging unless you have a way of holding them all together, because with a bunch of wires going into one node, it's easier for the whole thing to fall apart. So the trick for that, I'll show you that now. What you want to do is cut off about, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 centimeters of wire, or maybe, I don't know, this is like 5 centimeters, 6. And then you just strip the whole thing, so you end up with a raw stranded wire. You want to do this with stranded wire. What we're going to do is we're going to take one strand of the wire and wrap it around all the others that we're going to use. So with my auto stripper, I'm just kind of making a bunch of little cuts so I can pull all these bits off. It's kind of a trick, but it's not too hard to do. One more. This one's being feisty. There we go. So now I have all the stranded wire, and I'm just going to pull out a few of them. And actually I have to strip and prepare the other wires too, so I'm just going to set these aside. But this is what you want. Just to ruin the suspense, what you're going to do when you have the other wires in is you're going to wrap this around so that they're all attached, and then you can solder them. Before we do any of that, we're going to want to tin these, but we might break that up into different segments of the video. So anyway, this is where you're at now. Like I mentioned before, we're going to want wires that go from the 12-volt bus and then loop to where the cape's going to be, coming from positive and from negative. We didn't include red and black wire. We only included one color of wire. So you can use this. You just have to be very careful that even though it's not labeled positive or negative, that you don't get the polarity switched. Alternatively, if on your own you have hookup wire, like we've got hookup wire like this, that's obviously a lot better because you can keep red with red and black with black. But I've done it both ways. If you're careful, you can just use the one color. Instead of measuring these exact lengths, what I like to do is just cut kind of a little bit too long. We have extra wire. Just cut these to about 20 or 25 centimeters, but that'll be longer than you need, and then later on we can cut it back. So I'm going to cut 4 of these wires, 2 that are going to go to the cape, positive and negative, and 2 that are going to be supplying power to the whole system. They're going to plug into the Molex connector here and then loop and provide these nodes power. So 1, 2, 3. I knew that actually I got a kind of scrap piece here that was short, so I brought another wire that I have right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now you've got these. Again, I didn't really measure them specifically, but you can see that they're long enough to make it to the other side of the board, or long enough to plug into the Molex connector. I'm just going to strip these. So there's going to be 2 going to the positive and 2 going to the negative. Oops. Doing okay here. So those were 2, let's say those are 2 for the positive, here's 2 for the negative. Okay, so the next step is that we're going to tin all of these, and I'll probably do that off video, but before I do that, I'm just going to kind of give you a preview of what we'll do in the next video. Basically, the big idea is that we're going to, after these are all tinned, we're going to bundle them together. We're going to take one of these single strands from the stripped wire, wrap it around the whole thing so that they're all bunched together, and then we're going to just solder the heck out of this thing. We'll probably inject even more solder to the whole bundle. And then after that's done, we're going to put a piece of shrink tubing over the top of it. And then we'll do the same thing for the negative. But so now what I'm going to do is start tinning all of these. Instead of showing you the entire thing, I'll tin one, I guess, in this video, just so you kind of know what it's like. If you haven't tinned wire before, it's really not too hard to do. It's always good though to tin wires before you solder them together. It'll just make them bond better. So just kind of reminding you of soldering tips here. Soldering tips, get it? You want to put a little bit of glob of solder on the iron. That's going to allow you to transfer heat to the wire. And then you don't actually put the solder directly to the iron. Now you're heating the wire with that glob of solder, and you kind of just want to get this nice bead that goes down. With this really fine stranded wire, it sometimes takes a while for the whole thing to heat up. So you can kind of start, but now you can see I'm applying solder to the wire, not to the soldering iron. And you can kind of like run it, I like to run it along just to make sure it's even. So that's a tinned wire. So do that for all of these and for all of these, and we'll see you in the next video. Yay, cool. All right, in the last video we told you about how we're going to be soldering all these nodes together. Where we left off is we said you should tin all of these wires so that they'll be ready to get soldered together. Also, we cut 4 of these 20 or 25 centimeter long pieces of motor lead that are going to provide power to the cape, and that will also be pulling power from the Molex connector to deliver it to these nodes. One thing also I didn't mention, which is just kind of an alternative before going through with all this, and actually before you even tin it, if you don't want to solder these into these huge nodes and you have wire nuts just laying around, these sorts of things can be really useful as kind of a quick way of putting everything together. You can just put 2 wires into the node and the 3 ESC wires and twist it on. We didn't include these in the kit, but we've seen a few people do that and it seems to work just fine. So just so you know, that's an alternative. But the heck with that. For us, we're actually going to just solder the whole darn thing. As you can see, all of these are tinned. We're going to do these positive ones first. Basically just kind of group it so they're all together. I'm kind of using my finger as a guide to make it so that they're all at the same level. It's going to be really easy with the 5 of these for one of them to kind of pull down low. So you just have to kind of babysit it and make sure that that doesn't happen. So kind of getting them into a bundle here. And this is kind of a tricky part. As you remember, we pulled out some single strands from our twisted pair wire. I like to kind of go under one of these and then back so that you have something to pull against. I'm just going to wrap this around. I made mine a little bit short. Maybe it should have been like 8 or 9 centimeters long. This is really only about 5 or 6 centimeters long, but it still does the trick. Now I can let go and they're all held together. If you tried soldering it without having this, it would be a lot harder. So, okay, I'm going to use this to kind of just hold the E-Chassis so you can see it. Now, this is a place where it's really okay to be super liberal with solder. I mean, you can just glob on a ton of solder. If you look here, you can see that some wires are going to kind of come out at a weird angle, and you can fidget with it a bit. I like them to all be somewhat parallel, but it doesn't have to be perfect. So, also because you have a lot of metal here, it's a huge heat sink. So it may take a while for the whole thing to kind of heat up. And once it does, it'll take a long time to cool down. So don't burn yourself, even if it's 30 seconds after. So now you can see I'm just kind of injecting a little bit of solder. It's just going into this. I'm moving the soldering iron around to wick solder into different places. It'll be really easy to get a big solder glob over some of the wires, but then if you turn it over, you may notice that solder didn't get to that side. So I'm starting to get this, trying to be careful not to pull any of the wires out from the bundle, flipping it over and kind of soldering around there. A lot of soldering is about inspecting too. After you solder something, you should always inspect to make sure the joints are good. It's really easy to burn your fingers here because you have a lot of thermal capacity. So now I've done that a little bit. I'm just going to inspect it. Looks like I might want a little bit more solder here, but it's looking pretty good. I'm going to change the angle here so I can get access to that. Okay, yeah, so here you can see it's gotten a little bit sloppy. This wire is kind of pulled down a bit and this one's up. It's still okay. There's still a lot of area to contact. When I heat this again, I'm going to see if I can push this forward a bit, but if I can't, you know, it's probably good enough. So I'm just kind of making it so you can see it with the camera. It kind of adds a little bit more challenge to this. But okay, so I'll try heating this up now. Just putting a little more solder on. Remember, adding solder also adds thermal conductivity path. And you obviously don't want to touch this thing, it's going to be very hot, but I'm kind of pushing the solder iron one way against these wires. Yeah, I don't think I'm really going to be able to move that other one, so I'm not going to worry about it. You can kind of see how I'm figuring out as I go. We just want to make sure there's a good, nice conductive path between all of these. But for good measure, I'm going to add a little more solder. So this isn't super clean by any means. If it really mattered, you know, you could be more meticulous than I'm being about it. But you know, for most hobbyists, this is just fine. For this application, it's just fine. It either works or it doesn't, kind of. As long as you're inspecting those joints, that's good. So yeah, it's pretty good. I think that's good. So now just remember, it has a huge thermal capacity. It's going to take a long time to cool off, so you can kind of leave that be. Now, one other thing that you may want to get for yourself to make things nicer is large shrink tubing. We did include some shrink tubing in your kit, but it's really just enough for the motors, and it's kind of too small for this. So if you have extra, you can try using that. But if you have other shrink tubing laying around, that's good. If you don't, you can just put a lot of electrical tape over this. Here I have snippers. I was just cutting off a little sharp strand. So, you know, this is an option. This one you can see is kind of breaking, but that's kind of what we're going to do. So I think that this shrink tubing I have is a little bit too small, possibly. So I may come back and try it with a larger piece. You see there's a load of conductor that's visible there. But I don't know, that might work. So then if you have a heat gun, you just heat it up and shrink it. I actually have one right behind me, so let me grab that and you'll see what that looks like. So just a moment. Okay, now this is a butane heat gun. I like these because they're really good in a field kit. You can take it anywhere without plugging into the wall. But if you just have a normal wall powered one, that works as well. So you can see it's just creating heat there. And there we go. Shrink this around. Now what I might do for good measure in this particular case, just because my blob was kind of large and it makes it so the shrink tubing can't really fit around all the insulation, is I might take electrical tape and just wrap it around here for good measure. I mean, you just don't want it to short out. So there's positive, and now I'm going to do the exact same thing with negative. I'm going to bundle them together. I'm going to add the two wires, one that will be providing power from the Molex connector and the other one that will be delivering power to the cape. And I'll do the same thing. We already did it once here, so I don't think we need to show it on the video. But that's basically how we do it. And then in the next video, we'll show you what to do with all these extra wires. So there we are.